Does it work? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I'm a postdoc at the research group for occupational toxicology at STAMI, and today I'll present a talk about occupational exposure to airborne micro and nanoplastics. I must admit that this is a bit on the side of what I usually do. I'm a molecular biologist, and I usually do exposure studies of cell cultures and animals to micro nanoplastics. So I would be happy to also answer any questions you might have about this. But hopefully the presentation will still make sense. Yeah, so this study is part of Plastics Fate, which is one of 5 EU-funded projects. They all aim to improve our understanding about how micro and nanoplastics affect the human body, and hopefully provide recommendation and guidelines for improved risk assessment strategies. So Plastics Fate consists of 28 partners from 11 countries, and the project itself will run until April 2025. At STAMI, we do exposure studies, as I mentioned, but we also aim to assess exposure levels in occupational settings. So what is micro and nanoplastics? Plastics, they are synthetic or natural materials, sort of biodegradable plastics that use polymers as the main ingredients. They have these nice properties that they can be molded, extruded, or pressed into solid objects of various shapes, which is why we find them so very useful. And we have several polymer types, which has their own use. Microplastics are generally classified as plastic particles above the size of 1,000 nanometers. Not everything above that, of course, but typically from 1 micron to 5 millimeters. Nanoplastics, on the other hand, you find various definitions, but EU has defined it as plastic particles less than 100 nanometers. These micro nanoplastics are formed by the degradation of larger plastic objects, of course, but also they can be intentionally manufactured, for instance, for the cosmetic industry and so on. And we do find them everywhere. It's been everywhere in the environment, all the way to the North Pole. But we also find them everywhere inside the human body now, that we have discovered them in various organs like liver, kidneys, blood samples, and even in the placenta. So this is, of course, a cause of concern, even though we still not know very much about what kind of health risks they actually pose. And most studies currently have been performed on commercially available polystyrene particles. So the knowledge we have about micro nanoplastics is mostly about very small polystyrene particles. So how are we exposed to these small plastic particles? So there are 3 main routes that we are exposed to. This is dermal exposure, food and drink, but also through the airways, which is especially relevant in an occupational setting. And as you can see by the illustration here, the larger particles will be stuck in the oral cavity and nose, whereas smaller particles will be able to penetrate the lung, and the smallest particles will be able to reach the deep lung tissue in the alveoli and possibly accumulate there or transfer over to the bloodstream or lymph system. So the aim of this study was to assess exposure levels of airborne micro nanoplastics in working environments. So we sort of chose or thought we could visit one of these 3: waste management and recycling facilities, wastewater treatment plants, and plastic packaging manufacturers. So initially we found this very nice waste management and recycling facility, which had its own area with plastics separated from the rest of the general waste, which would be really nice to measure, but unfortunately the facility burned down. So the data today I will be presenting from this plastic packaging manufacturer in Norway. And this facility uses plastic granules, as you can see here, as raw material for the production of plastic packaging and plastic film. And these contain mostly pristine plastic, but also a certain percentage of recycled plastic. And this is a picture of the facility where they have all these various machines and grinding of plastic waste and heat extrusion molding machines for bottles. They also had a sterile compartment for food packaging and stuff, but we did the sampling inside this less sterile area. So this is the sampling equipment. We used personal air samplers, which has been described earlier today. People can equip it in the chest area and not too far from the mouth, and also a particle counter. So these are the results from the personal air sampling. These were taken for an 8-hour working day, and we don't see a lot of dust particles here. It's way under the exposure limit. And there is no difference, clear difference at least, between these different work tasks that the workers perform. For the stationary sampling, we see even less, which makes sense. As you walk around, the dust will, of course, float around. But here's the result from the particle counting, which was performed near a heat extrusion machine, where we hypothesized it's the greater chance of finding nano-sized particles. And the average size was about 70 nanometers. So we do find nano-sized particles inside the facility. Scanning electron microscopy pictures shows small particles in aggregates. However, since plastic is mostly carbon, we are not able to do this chemical analysis and tell if this is plastic or if it's other dust particles. But luckily we have some collaborators who can do chemical analysis, and they do pyro-GCMS, where they burn the samples and analyze the pyrolysates. And not surprisingly, they find in the personal samples people working in location where there is a lot of polyethylene plastic. You find polyethylene, but we also find quite a lot of polypropylene. And where this come from, we can only speculate, but it could come from the workers' clothes, of course. Most of us wear clothes containing quite a large amount of plastics. And we also detected some polyurethane. This could also come, as I mentioned earlier, that the plastic granules themselves contains a certain amount of recycled plastic. And you see it's the highest level is observed in the samples from the machinists. Those are the one who has more direct contact with the machines. In the stationary samples, we haven't found much. Still find some significant levels of polyurethane. This brings me to the summary that we detected micro and nano-sized particles in the collected air samples. Nano-sized particles were detected in close proximity to where heating and molding of plastic occurred. And chemical analysis detected 3 different types of plastic polymers, as I just showed you. But still, we can't say if these plastic particles are nano-sized particles or bigger particles. So this is the remaining question on what we would like to do, to go back to this facility and do size fractionation and analyze the different fractions for these plastic polymers. Yeah, and these are the people involved in plastics weight at STAMI and also our collaborators at NILU. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Someone once told me that there's also plastic within the cups that you are drinking from, so that you shouldn't...
Probably.
Yeah. Okay, we do have time for questions. Yeah, Andrew?
Thanks. Really interesting presentation, and clearly something that we're all starting to think about. You mentioned that nanoplastics have been found in a variety of organs.
Yeah.
So are there any health consequences that have been reported directly attributable to nanoparticles in this plastics area?
In the cell cultures and the animal experiments, there are some effects, but um, it's no major effect. So it doesn't seem to have a very large consequence. But as I didn't mention today, a lot of these plastics can contain additives, of course, and also be contaminated with pathogens. So maybe if you have that type of plastic, which I guess you could expect to find also in the waste management and recycling facilities, maybe these particles could have a greater effect on the human health.
So what advice would you give to workers in these kinds of facilities where they might be exposed to the materials?
To use some kind of protective equipment, I guess. This is, yeah.
But if there's no reported health consequences, then that's an additional cost on that industry. So it's getting that balance right, isn't it, between measuring something because it could be a potential cause of ill health and it actually being a cause of ill health. So I think for me, I would be cautious at recommending any kind of respiratory protective equipment without the evidence.
Yeah, it's definitely in the beginning stage, and we need a lot more evidence, of course.
Hi there, thank you for your presentation. I just wondered, you reported the 3 different plastics that you measured in the air, and I wondered if you had measured the bulk, so you measured the plastic bottle, or, you know, so and a ratio between the 3 different plastics could then absolutely say that that worker had been exposed to the ratio of those. I appreciate it comes from clothing and different sources on the worker, but if you could identify by ratio, you know, say it's 1 to 1 to 3 polyurethane and the other 2, maybe you could, you know, categorically say that that was from exposure.
Yeah, I guess we could ideally we would ask all the workers, of course, to wear a cotton or or something, and then you could tell that the plastic detected most likely came from the facility. But we have to also we plan to ask this facility also what kind of recycled plastic and how much, if they have any information about that in these plastic granules. So, for instance, if there is very little polypropylene there, then I guess we can assume this that the most of the portion of polypropylene would come from clothing. Yeah.
Okay. Have you an idea of the weight of the occupational exposure compared to the food and drink exposure presently?
Sorry, if I have.
You are also contaminated by food and drink, as you said.
Yeah.
So, have you an idea of the proportion of both routes?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess in these occupational settings where people work directly with plastic, I guess the airway exposure it should be much higher, at least than the general population. But how it compares to the intake of food, I'm not sure. There is one paper that claims that we eat 1 credit card a week of plastic, but this is a quite disputable paper. So, yeah, but I can only guess on this.